Section 3 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3. The Story of Glaucus and Silla. The third book is mainly concerned with the story of Glaucus and Silla. It tells how Glaucus, having won the power of living in the sea, saw and loved Silla (line 399), and tried to win her, but, tiring of the pursuit, turned aside and yielded to the wiles of Circe (line 418). After a time he awoke to a sense of his degradation and was condemned to impotence for a long space of time, while Silla appeared to be dead (line 619). During this time he was witness of a shipwreck. One of the men from the ship, being carried by the sea towards Glaucus, thrust a scroll into his hand, but fell back and perished with the rest (line 674). On the scroll Glaucus found a message that gave him hope of deliverance. When Endymion, in the course of his wanderings, met Glaucus, the old man hailed him joyfully and claimed his help (line 234). By rightful use of the magic scroll, Glaucus was restored to youthful energy and Silla was revived (line 780), while those of the dead, whose bodies had been carefully laid aside by Glaucus during the period of his punishment, were restored to life, and all went in joyful procession to the hall of Neptune (line 868). There, after the singing of a hymn to the god, a vision of Oceanus was seen (line 994). Endymion fell senseless, but in his swoon received the promise of Diana that he should soon be raised to immortality. When he awoke he found himself in a cool forest beside a placid lake. Representing a poetical movement. We have found that in the first book of this poem the underlying meaning, so far as one can trace it, appears to be concerned, in the earlier part of the book, with the new movement that made itself felt in the realm of English poetry from the middle of the 18th century, while in the latter part of the first and throughout the second book we are told of the experiences through which a poet might pass as he came under the influence of such a movement and strove to realise its ideals in his own work. In the third book it seems that the more individual aspect of the story retires into the background for a time, and we are again chiefly concerned with the larger movements of English poetry. There is, as in the last book, an introductory passage of about 40 lines, the significance of which may be more suitably considered when the meaning of the main theme of the book has been dealt with. But after this there is a further passage, to line 187, that intervenes before the story really moves on its way again, lines that are mainly devoted to praise of the beauty and influence of the moon. Endymion's love for the moon. We are told of the gentle and far-reaching nature of this influence. Thou dost bless everywhere with silver lip, kissing dead things to life. Line 56. Thy benediction passeth not one obscure hiding place, one little spot where pleasure may be sent. She is shining now, though with but a pale light, upon Endymion in his wanderings. Thy cheek is pale, for one whose cheek is pale. Thou dost bewail his tears who weeps for thee. Line 75. Endymion's love for Diana. But even these faint beams have power to warm the heart of Endymion and to comfort him in his solitude. Endymion wonders at the power that she exercises. It had pervaded all the occupations of his previous life, and as he grew up it still blended with all his ardours. Line 160. Then his strange love came, and the influence of the moon grew less. She came, and thou didst fade and fade away, yet not entirely. No, thy starry sway has been an under-passion to this hour. Line 177. He is torn between the attraction of the two. Dearest love, forgive that I can think away from thee and live. Pardon me, airy planet, that I prize one thought beyond thine argent luxuries. Line 183. And it is, of course, obvious that he does not recognise the identity of the two. The meaning of the contrast. It can hardly be doubted, if we keep in view the general purpose of the poem and the length at which this matter is treated, that we have here something of significance in relation to the work of the poet, some aspect of poetic theory that Keats felt to be of importance. It is, of course, true that Keats had been, from childhood, passionately fond of moonlight, and this fact no doubt influenced the tone of the passage and may, indeed, have given rise to it. But it says more than this, and one may find a clue to the further meaning in a repeated failure of Endymion to recognise the identity of his heavenly visitant with the moon, whose beauty affected him so powerfully. And starting with this as a guide, we may interpret the passage somewhat in this way. Footnote. This point occurs in each of the 4 books. When Endymion sees the vision for the first time, he is watching the moon and is fascinated by her beauty. Book 1, line 591. She disappears behind a cloud, line 597, and then the goddess appears, line 602, but he does not connect the two. Again, before he begins his wanderings underground, the beauty of the moon fills him with delight and longing, but so little is he conscious of her identity that he begs her to point out his love's far dwelling. Book 2, line 178. In the 4th book, the situation has grown even more complex because of the appearance of Diana in a new form, and the perplexity arising from his failure to perceive her identity is greater than ever. Book 4, lines 429, 438, 497, and line 95. End footnote. Cynthia, the moon, stands for that element in the attractiveness of poetry which depends upon beauty of form. It is, indeed, an influence as widespread as life itself. There is a rhythm in the growth of the flowers, in the song of the birds, in the movement of the rivers and the tides, and it is, of course, a large part of the very essence of poetry. But poetry must also express feeling and passion, though the moving power of passion will visit the poet less frequently, will be less constantly present as a force, than the gentler and milder influence of beauty in form. Yet, if the poet is to reach any high level of attainment, he must come to recognise that these two, different as their appearance may be, are not to be finally separated. When the poet, in moments of greatest achievement, attains his ideal, he finds not merely that beauty of expression and beauty of feeling are both present, but that they can no longer be distinguished from one another. In the white heat of the finest inspiration he learns that they are one. Footnote. Compare what Mr. A. C. Bradley says in his famous lecture, Poetry for Poetry's Sake. The value of versification, when it is indissolubly fused with meaning, can hardly be exaggerated. The gift for feeling it, even more, perhaps, than the gift for feeling the value of style, is the specific gift for poetry, as distinguished from other arts. But versification, taken as far as possible, all by itself, has a very different worth. Some aesthetic worth it has. How much, you may experience by reading poetry in a language of which you do not understand a syllable. The pleasure is quite appreciable, but it is not great. Nor in actual poetic experience do you meet with it as such at all. For, I repeat, it is not added to the pleasure of the meaning when you read poetry that you do understand. By some mystery the music is then the music of the meaning, and the two are one. Oxford Lectures on Poetry, page 21. End footnote. Ocean Relics. Meanwhile Endymion has been wandering in the depths of ocean. He has passed many relics of former days. Old rusted anchors, helmets, breastplates large Of gone sea warriors, brazen beaks and targe, rudders that for 100 years had lost the sway of human hand. Line 123. And these things give him a feeling of depression which is only removed by the soothing influence of the moon. The passage based upon Shakespeare. The passage, as is well known, is based upon the account given by Clarence of one part of his dream, and Geoffrey's remark upon it is worth remembering. It comes of no ignoble lineage, nor shames its high descent. Footnote. Methought I saw 1,000 fearful wrecks, 10,000 men that fishers gnawed upon, wedges of gold, great anchors, heaps of pearl, inestimable stones, unvalued jewels, all scattered in the bottom of the sea. Some lay in dead men's skulls, and in those holes, where eyes did once inhabit, there were crept, as 'twere in scorn of eyes, reflecting gems, which wooed the slimy bottom of the deep, and mocked the dead bones that lay scattered by. King Richard III, Act 1, Scene 4. End footnote. This is well put, but it falls short of the truth, for in these lines Keats has rehandled the lines from Shakespeare with so much skill and imaginative power that they surpass the material of which they were built. But for our present purpose it is more to the point to see if we can define the character of the changes that Keats has introduced, for in this way we have the best hope of getting upon the track of his purpose. It will be seen, on comparing the two passages, that Keats has throughout laid stress on the antiquity of the remains which Endymion found on the sea bottom, while Shakespeare does not refer at all to this aspect of them. Thus the great anchors of Clarence's dream become old rusted anchors, wedges of gold are transformed into gold vase embossed with long forgotten story, and several things not found in the earlier passage, such as the mouldering scrolls writ in the tongue of heaven by those souls who first were on the earth, are introduced, all emphasizing the same point. Some men would have delighted to examine these relics, but it was not so with Endymion. A cold leaden awe these secrets struck into him, and unless Diana had chased away that heaviness, he might have died. Line 136. What Keats appears to have in mind is that the study of old things merely because they are old is not an inspiring pursuit for a poet. Antiquarianism, as he may have met with in the pages of Strutt or of Ritson, only depresses the spirit of poetry, and may even kill it if a higher inspiration does not come to keep it alive. That Keats did not undervalue the imaginative treatment of stories of olden days is abundantly clear, but for one who could do this with the genius of Scott, there were scores who would be dull and wearisome, and the poet hurried from them to seek fresh inspiration elsewhere. Glaucus. At length, as he lifted up his eyes, he saw, far in the concave green of the sea, an old man sitting calm and peacefully. Line 191. This was Glaucus, whose story fills the greater part of this book, for though Endymion plays an important part in the development of events, the interest attaching to his actions is for the time subordinate, while Glaucus and his past history take the most prominent place. Glaucus's story. The story of Glaucus, as he told it to Endymion, lines 318 and following, offers in its early stages some points of similarity to that of Endymion himself. He was a fisherman, and he delighted in his life upon the sea. He felt the same craving as Endymion had felt for quietness and meditation and communion with nature. The crown of all my life was utmost quietude. More did I love to lie in cavern rude, keeping in wait whole days for Neptune's voice, and if it came at last, hark and rejoice. Line 352. And he so far achieved his desire that he found himself able to live and move freely in the depths of the ocean. Its meaning. It is not until we reach a later part of the story of Glaucus that we meet with any very clear indications of its allegorical meaning, but it may be worth while to point out at once what appears to be the true line of interpretation, making use by anticipation of clues that will be found further on. The story of Endymion, as we have seen, represents in one aspect the growth of the new spirit which was making itself felt in English poetry before the time of Keats, and which found its fulfilment in what we know as the New Romantic movement. It is this more general side of his theme that the poet appears to be dealing with in the third book, the more individual and personal aspect of it being dropped for the time. A new poetic movement. Just as Endymion represents the poetic spirit which was animating the age of Keats, so Glaucus, in his youth, may be regarded as representing a different poetic spirit, animating an earlier age. Footnote. It does not appear necessary to take the 1,000 years, line 326, in a literal sense. End footnote. His loneliness, his longing for utmost quietude, his desire to be free of Neptune's kingdom, line 377, his entrance into this new life, his passion for and pursuit of Silla, all these early experiences, corresponding largely to those through which Endymion passed, represent the yearnings, the idealisms, and the tentative efforts which belong to the development of a new movement, and while the details vary, the general course that it follows is much the same in one age as in another. Such a movement, for example, was that which had for its aim the attainment of correctness of style and polish of form in the days of Waller and his contemporaries, and those who kept that ideal before them no doubt strove with no less earnestness and sincerity to reach it than the poets of a later age strove after the different ideals that seemed to them so much loftier. We are told clearly about the earnestness and eagerness of the pursuit. My passion grew the more I saw her dainty hue gleam delicately through the azure clear, until 'twas too fierce agony to bear. Line 407. The failure. But from this point his story ceases to resemble that of Endymion, for, impatient at his want of success in attaining his ideal, Glaucus turned aside to seek help from Circe, and under the influence of her baleful charms allowed himself to be seduced from his aim, to forget his high ideal, and to follow an unworthy and degrading course of life. After a time he came to himself and saw in her true light the witch to whose charms he had surrendered. He watched her as she exercised her evil influence upon those around her. Wizard and brute, laughing and wailing, grovelling, serpentinging, showing tooth, tusk, and venom bag and sting. Oh, such deformities! Line 500. Until he was filled with remorse. But it was too late. He had incurred the fierce displeasure of the goddess and was condemned to an age-long decrepitude. He plunged once more into the ocean, only to discover that Silla was dead, slain by the hated power of Circe, and as for himself, it was not long before his limbs became gaunt, withered, sapless, feeble, cramped, and lame. Line 637. If we now attempt to follow up the clue which has guided us thus far, it would appear that we must look for some critical phase in the development of English poetry where, in the view of Keats, things took a disastrous course, where poetry had turned aside from its nobler aims, became unfaithful to its lofty ideals, and falling under influences which, though superficially attractive, were essentially mean and base, was reduced to a state of decrepitude. And it is not difficult to put one's finger upon the period when, in the opinion of Keats, a change of this nature had come over English poetry. He regarded the spirit that became dominant after the Restoration as a spirit of unfaithfulness to the true ideals of poetry. He hated, says Sir Sidney Colvin, the whole Augustan and post-Augustan tribe of social and moral essayists in verse, and Pope, their illustrious master, most of all. His feeling was, of course, shared by other poets of the time. There is a passage in an essay of Wordsworth's, which had appeared not long before Keats began to write Endymion, in which Pope and his school are described in terms that Keats would have heartily endorsed, and one may almost suspect that the younger poet is merely translating into the picturesque imagery of his poem what the elder one has expressed in direct criticism. Wordsworth on Pope. The passage reads as follows: "The arts by which Pope, soon afterwards, contrived to procure to himself a more general and a higher reputation than perhaps any English poet ever attained during his lifetime, are known to the judicious; and as well known is it to them that the undue exertion of these arts is the cause why Pope has for some time held a rank in literature from which, if he had not been seduced by an over-love of immediate popularity, and had confided more in his native genius, he never could have descended. He bewitched the nation by his melody, and dazzled it by his polished style, and was himself blinded by his own success. Having wandered from humanity in his eclogues with boyish inexperience, the praise which these compositions obtained tempted him into the belief that nature was not to be trusted, at least in pastoral poetry. To prove this by example, he put his friend Gay upon writing those eclogues which the author intended to be burlesque. The instigator of the work and his admirers could perceive in them nothing but what was ridiculous. Nevertheless, though these poems contain some detestable passages, the effect, as Dr. Johnson well observes, of reality and truth become conspicuous even when the intention was to show them grovelling and degraded. Keats on the Classical School. In Sleep and Poetry, which had appeared only a few months before Keats wrote the passage now under consideration, he had expressed his feelings on this matter in no uncertain way. After speaking with enthusiasm of the work of the poets of the Elizabethan age, when the Muses were well nigh cloyed with honours, he goes on to ask, could all this be forgotten? And the answer is, yes, a schism nurtured by foppery and barbarism made great Apollo blush for this his land. He speaks of them as dead to things they knew not of, and finally denounces them as an ill-fated, impious race, that blasphemed the bright lyrist to his face and did not know it. No, they went about holding a poor decrepit standard out, marked with most flimsy mottos, and in large the name of one Boileau. Book 2, line 181 and following. The very expressions of which Keats makes use in this passage suggest in a striking way its relation with this part of the story of Glaucus. While under the spell of Circe he was dead to the beauty of Silla, he had been guilty of impiety in deserting the nobler ideal for the baser. He was certainly ill-fated, and the word decrepit would apply more exactly to him, as described in the story, than to the standard of the school of Pope. We may take it then that Keats is in this passage describing to us in picturesque form what he regarded as the tragical history of English poetry after the Restoration. He shows us how it was ready for a fresh adventure, and how, when a new and beautiful ideal was in sight, it had allowed itself to be turned aside from its high aims, and had abandoned itself to the pursuit of false pleasures, a course that resulted in a long period of hopeless futility. The ideal had, to all appearance, perished. Such was certainly his view of the course of poetry in that period, and it would appear that this is the real meaning of the story of Glaucus. What Circe stands for. It seems, indeed, that Keats, not content with drawing this unflattering picture of the general tendency and influence of the school of poetry for which he felt such a hearty dislike, has, in the figure of Circe, sketched a portrait, or perhaps one should say a caricature, of no less a person than its distinguished head and chief, Pope himself. This is suggested by certain resemblances between the expressions which Wordsworth applies to Pope in the passage quoted above, and the account of Circe in the poem. Footnote. Note, for instance, the arts by which Pope contrived. the undue exertion of these arts, and compare what is said of Gay's Eclogues. The instigator of the work, Pope, could perceive in them nothing but what was ridiculous, with line 509. Oft times, upon the sudden, she laughed out. End footnote. It is confirmed by the description of those who surrounded Circe as showing tooth, tusk, and venom bag, and sting. Line 502. Words that aptly represent the tribe of petty and malicious satirists that basked in the sunshine of Pope's favours, or, more often, writhed under his lash. But the passage that appears to leave little, if any, room for doubt as to the intention of Keats occurs a little further down in the description of the same incident. Avenging, slow, anon she took a branch of mistletoe, and emptied on't a black dull gurgling phial. Groaned one and all, as if some piercing trial was sharpening for their pitiable bones. She lifted up the charm. Appealing groans from their poor breasts went suing to her ear in vain. Remorseless as an infant's bier, she wished against their eyes the sooty oil, whereat was heard a noise of painful toil, increasing gradual to a tempest rage, shrieks, yells, and groans of torture pilgrimage, until their grieved bodies 'gan to bloat and puff from the tail's end to stifled throat. Then was appalling silence. Then a sight more wildering than all that horse affright. For the whole herd, as by a whirlwind writhen, went through the dismal air like one huge python antagonizing Boreas, and so vanished. Yet there was not a breath of wind. She banished these phantoms with a nod. Line 513. The Dunciad. One can hardly fail to recognise in these lines a picture, drawn with no small degree of humour and skill, of the treatment meted out by Pope to the petty scribblers of his day in the pages of the Dunciad. The merciless spirit in which the punishment was administered, the shrieks and yells and groans that it produced, and the entire disappearance of the victims from the literary stage are excellently depicted. Horneck, Roome, Jacob, Good. Who would ever hear their names today unless he reads the lines in which they received their castigation? Pope, indeed, banished these phantoms with a nod. The words avenging, slow, with which the passage referring to the Dunciad opens, may or may not have been chosen with reference to that poem, but they apply to it more exactly than they do to the Circe of classical legend. In the preface to the first edition, 1728, Pope indicates that his purpose is to avenge himself upon his enemies. I will only observe as a fact that every week for these 2 months past the town has been persecuted with pamphlets, advertisements, letters, and weekly essays, not only against the wit and writings, but against the character and person of Mr. Pope, while as for the slowness, the same preface speaks of it as having been the labour of full 6 years of his life. The story of the rescued scroll. An incident that is related a little further on in the story of Glaucus appears to carry a meaning that confirms the line of interpretation that has been given to the preceding part of the poem. After Glaucus has passed a long time in the state of decrepitude to which he had been reduced by Circe, he was one day sitting on a rock that stood out above the spray when he saw a vessel approach. A storm arose, the vessel was wrecked before his eyes. The feebleness to which he had been reduced made of no avail his eager desire to save those who were drowning, and he saw one after another sink helpless into the deep. While he was still watching there emerged from the waves an old man's hand, holding out a scroll and a wand. Glaucus seized these treasures, and even touched the hand that held them, but it slipped from his grasp and sank. The storm abated, and the sun shone again. I was athirst to search the book, and in the warming air parted its dripping leaves with eager care. Strange matters did it treat of, and drew on my soul, page after page, till well nigh won into forgetfulness. Line 676. And, above all, he found, to his great joy, that the book contained the promise of his ultimate deliverance, for it spoke of a youth, by heavenly power loved and led, who should stand before him, and who was to be told how to bring about the redemption of Glaucus from the punishment to which he had been condemned. And it was added, "The youth elect must do the thing, or both will be destroyed." Line 710. A redeeming influence. To interpret rightly the significance of this incident in relation to the meaning of the book as a whole, we must look for some influence that gave promise of new life to English poetry after the period of decrepitude which was the penalty of yielding to the influence of Pope. It may be well to note in passing that we are not concerned with the justice or injustice of such a method of representing this school of poetry. Whether it is to be regarded as fair, though severe, satire, or an unfair caricature, is a matter outside our present inquiry. There is no doubt as to the views of Keats on the point, and the interpretation here suggested corresponds with those views. It is, however, generally agreed that the influences which brought about a change of spirit in English poetry are represented most completely in the revival of interest in the ballad, and that Bishop Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry at once expressed and stimulated this interest in the most effective manner. Wordsworth, in the essay to which reference has already been made, speaks with great enthusiasm of Percy's work, and after pointing out the influence that it had exerted on the revival of poetry in Germany, adds, "For our own country its poetry has been absolutely redeemed by it." Footnote: Prose Works of William Wordsworth, edited by Knight, Volume 2, page 247. It is worth noting that in September 1817, when Keats was writing this third book of Endymion, he was staying at Oxford with his friend Bailey, and his letters record that they had been reading Wordsworth together. See Letter to Reynolds, 21st of September 1817. In a letter written to Bailey a little later, November 1817, he refers again to Wordsworth. End footnote. The correspondence between this expression of Wordsworth's and the story as shaped by Keats is so striking that one can hardly suppose it to be accidental, especially when taken in conjunction with the parallelism previously noted between essay and poem, and it is not unlikely that in this sentence we have the germ out of which the incident originally grew in the mind of Keats. The history of the Ballads. When we come to examine the details of the incident, their correspondence with the history of the Ballads becomes evident. He tells us, in words which seem carefully adapted to the meaning underlying the surface, that the crew had gone, by one and one, to pale oblivion, line 665. And even the one whose hand, emerging, held up the scroll that Glaucus safely grasped, was not himself rescued, but sank again and disappeared. This corresponds exactly with the fate that has overtaken the makers of the Ballads. Some fragments of their work have been rescued from destruction, but they themselves have all sunk down into oblivion. Not even their names have survived, nor is it known who gathered together the ballads that Percy found in the famous scroll that he rescued only by a hair's breadth from destruction. Yet, if only the lovers of poetry had stirred themselves earlier, how much more might have been rescued! It was not till the publication of Allan Ramsay's Evergreen and Tea Table Miscellany, and of Bishop Percy's Relics, 1765, says Mr. Andrew Lang, that a serious effort was made to recover Scottish and English folk songs from the recitation of the old people who still knew them by heart. And when we ask why the effort was not made earlier, the answer that Keats puts forward was that it was due to the paralysing effect of the influence of the school of Pope. Oh, they had all been saved, but crazed eld annulled my vigorous cravings, and thus quelled and curbed, think on't, O Latmian, did I sit writhing with pity, and a cursing fit against that hell-born Circe. Line 661. The interest that they aroused is described in the lines already quoted, and the story goes on to tell of the promise of redemption that was contained in the scroll, and of how this promise was fulfilled when Endymion, representing the spirit of the new poetry, scattered first upon Glaucus and then upon Silla some of the powerful fragments of the rescued scroll, and how, under its magic influence, Glaucus was restored to his youthful vigour and beauty, and Silla came to life again. Underneath the symbolism, we can hardly fail to recognise that Keats is representing to us the restoration of a true poetic ideal, and the infusion of fresh life and energy into poetry after its long period of futile decrepitude, and that he is emphasising the part played by the rediscovery of the ballads in bringing about this renaissance. The other details of the story, the undoing of the tangled thread, the thread which was so weak for Glaucus, but which Endymion handled safely, the reading of the shell on which Glaucus could see no sign or character, the breaking of the wand against the lyre, which was followed by some sweet and sudden music, all these are significant in different ways of the magic power immanent in the spirit of the new poetry. The Task of Glaucus. It will be remembered that the same passage that gave to Glaucus the hope of ultimate redemption spoke of a task that he must undertake during the period of his bondage. All lovers tempest-tossed, and in the savage overwhelming lost, he shall deposit side by side, until time's creeping shall the dreary space fulfil. Line 703. This may be taken to represent the reverent regard that was paid to the great poets of former times, even during the period of poetical decrepitude. There is no lack of evidence on this point. Dryden, in his Preface to the Fables, for example, makes a comparison between Chaucer and Ovid which works out on the whole to the advantage of the English poet. The imitation of Spenser, sometimes in form only, at other times in a way that shows a feeling for the magic beauty of his poetry, was a frequent occupation among the minor and an occasional amusement of the major poets of this time. Footnote. Professor Phelps has an interesting chapter on this matter in the beginnings of the English Romantic movement, Gin, and in an appendix gives a list of 57 imitations of Spenser published between 1706 and 1775. End footnote. While Johnson's Lives of the Poets and Thomas Warton's Observations on the Fairy Queen, which appeared only 9 years after the death of Pope, illustrate the same feeling. The spirit that had animated these poets was no longer a vital force in English poetry, but the care that was taken of them was a hopeful sign for the future. When Endymion came to them he found their patient lips all ruddy, for here death no blossom nips. Line 739. That is to say, their poetry remained unspoiled, even though for the time they could not be said to exercise any living influence. But now, after renewing the youthful vigour of Glaucus and Silla, Endymion passed on, showering those powerful fragments on the dead, and as he passed, each lifted up his head, as doth a flower at Apollo's touch. Line 784. The revival of interest in poetry which resulted from the study of the ballads spread to the works of the older poets, so that they began once more to take their place among the vital influences of the day. The music of poetry was once more heard in the land. Delicious symphonies, like airy flowers, budded and swelled, and full blown, shed full showers of light, soft unseen leaves of sounds divine. Line 798. The other host. As the host of those who had been redeemed by this magic power moved on their way to the palace of Neptune, they saw descending thick another multitude, whereat more quick moved either host. Line 820. This is probably intended to refer to the romantic movement on the continent of Europe, more particularly in France and Germany, which developed side by side with the movement in England, and to the way in which each movement stimulated the other. The festival in Neptune's palace. The closing part of the book describes the joyous celebration of this fresh renaissance held in the palace of Neptune, symbolical of the enthusiasm and delight that were aroused by the revived interest in the poetry of past ages. The general bearing of the passage seems sufficiently clear, but there are two incidents in it that require a little closer examination. Oceanus. The first of these is the appearance at the festival of a number of the more ancient gods. On oozy throne, smooth-moving, came Oceanus the old, to take a latest glimpse at his sheepfold before he went into his quiet cave to muse for ever. Line 993. And with him came Doris and Nereus and Amphion, an era for Arion, and others. We cannot but call to mind the passage in the second book, lines 639 and following, where Endymion comes upon the vision of Cybele in the course of his wanderings underground. In both cases Keats appears to be suggesting that the spirit of poetry, as it found expression in the earliest efforts of mankind, is looking with benevolent regard upon this latest manifestation, differing greatly in form and expression, yet animated by the same spirit of reverence and fostered by the same divine protection as in former ages. The swooning of Endymion. The second tells of the swoon into which Endymion fell after looking upon this vision of the elder gods. The palace whirls around giddy Endymion, seeing he was there far strayed from mortality. Line 1005. He fell unconscious at the feet of Neptune and was carried away by the Nereids. It can hardly be doubted that some distinct meaning underlies this incident, and, keeping a firm hold of the clue by which we have been guided thus far, we may arrive at a reasonable interpretation of it. The salient points that must be kept in view are that it is Endymion who has played a leading part in the revival of the dead forms of those who had been tended by the care of Glaucus, and yet, when the revival is complete, and is the occasion of great rejoicing, Endymion alone is unable to bear it, and sinks into unconsciousness, notwithstanding the assurances that he has received of an early fulfilment of his desires. Bearing in mind that Endymion stands for the spirit of the new poetry, we may recognise, as has already been pointed out, that we have here sketched for us the way in which this spirit brought renewed life and significance into the study of the earlier poets. They had never ceased to be regarded with respect and admiration, but under the new influence they came to have a fresh vitality that was a source of delight and an occasion for thanksgiving. So far the path is fairly plain, and though the next stretch of it is less clearly marked, we are probably following the right track if we interpret the remaining part of the story as showing that although the spirit of the new poetry has reacted thus powerfully on the older poetry, it cannot live upon the result of this. There is hope and promise that its ideals may be fulfilled, but for the moment the very success that it has achieved in giving new life and meaning to the poetry of earlier days may tend to lessen its own vitality. Certainly it cannot flourish upon inspiration drawn merely from its predecessors. In seeking them it has strayed too far from mortality. It can only become a living force by seeking contact with the actual life of men and women, and by entering into their joys and sorrows. The way in which this is accomplished, and the ideal finally reached, will be found in the next book. The introduction to the third book. The lines that form the introduction to this book are not in Keats' happiest vein, nor do they, at first sight, appear to have much bearing on the main theme of the poem. Their most obvious reference is political, and in this sense they denounce the empty pomp of incompetent rulers who have induced submissive peoples to receive them with mistaken enthusiasm. But an examination of the phrases used makes it evident that they may bear another meaning, and indeed appear to have been chosen for that purpose. We may question the poetic fitness of such expressions as most prevailing tinsel or baaing vanities, but there can be no doubt that they effectively describe the feeling that Keats entertained for the writings of Pope and his school. He regarded them as showing not one tinge of sanctuary splendour, that is to say, they had never offered Milton's prayer that he might be from out his secret altar touched with sacred fire. And he may well have been thinking more of them than of those who had incurred Leigh Hunt's political animosity when he wrote, "With unladen breasts, save of blown self-applause, they proudly mount to their spirit's perch, their being's high account, their tip-top nothings, their dull skies, their thrones. Line 12. The contrast that he proceeds to draw describes no less clearly his feeling as to the loftier aims and ideals of the poetical movement in the midst of which he was living when compared with those of the previous age. No, there are throne seats unscalable but by a patient wing, a constant spell, or by ethereal things that, unconfined, can make a ladder of the eternal wind, and poise about in cloudy thunder tents to watch the abysm birth of elements. Line 23. A careful reading of the whole passage makes it evident that while the political meaning is on the surface, the literary is clearly to be seen just underneath it. Moreover, while the political reference has no recognisable bearing on the matters with which the poem is concerned, the literary significance of the passage brings it into immediate relation with the meaning which we have found to underlie the story of this book. End of section. Section 4 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4. The Story. The story of the fourth book turns upon one strong situation which is presented with some degree of power. The situation arises from a new and irresistible attraction that Endymion feels for an Indian maiden, who now appears for the first time. After his sea adventures he finds himself in a green forest near a placid lake, and there he hears a plaintive cry (line 40), which, as he discovers, comes from a beautiful Indian maiden who has failed to find solace in the revelry of Bacchus (line 268), and is longing for human affection. He is torn between the attraction he feels for her and his devotion to his heavenly love. The development of the situation thus presented is less effective, and one cannot but feel that the story has suffered for the sake of the allegory. Mercury comes down, and at a touch of his wand there springs from the earth two jet-black winged steeds, on which Endymion and the maiden fly up into the regions of the sky. Line 347. There, overcome by slumber, he dreams that he is in heaven, and wakes to find himself indeed in the presence of his divine love. Line 436. In sore perplexity he turns now to her, now to the Indian maid, and yet, in spite of all appearance, he knows in his heart that he is not unfaithful to either. At length he finds that his companion has vanished, and soon afterwards her steed plunges down to the earth. Line 512. Endymion's steed bears him to the cave of quietude, where he fails to see the guests passing on their way to Diana's wedding feast, though he seems to have heard their song. Lines 556 and 611. His steed brings him down to earth again, and there he finds his Indian love. Line 623. Now that he feels his feet once more planted on solid ground, he determines to devote himself to this earthly human love, feeling that he has been too presumptuous in aspiring to a heavenly destiny. To Endymion's dismay, she tells him that she is forbidden to accept his love. Line 752. He sits despondent on the very spot where he had first seen the vision of Diana, and while he sits there, Peona appears. Line 800. She sees his downcast look, and bids him be happy, for she will rejoice that he has found such a lovely mate. He declares that he will live a hermit's life, and that Peona alone shall visit him, but expresses a hope that the Indian maid will stay with Peona. Line 870. He bids farewell to them both, and they leave him, but he calls them back, begging them to meet him once more that evening in the grove behind great Diana's temple. Line 911. The denouement forms an effective close to the story. As the sun sinks, Endymion makes his way to the temple, thinking that surely his troubles and his life must now have an ending. The two maidens are there, but as he utters his desire that heaven's will may be declared, a wonderful change takes place. His Indian love is transformed, and he sees that she is no other than his divine love, Cynthia or Diana. They bid farewell to Peona with a promise that she should meet them many a time in these forests, and they vanish. Peona went home through the gloomy wood in wonderment. Its meaning. We have now to consider the meaning of this closing part of the story and its relation to the allegory as we have thus far traced it. Footnote. In his edition of the poems of Keats, Methuen 1907, Professor de Selincourt has given a more detailed explanation of the allegory as developed in the fourth book than has elsewhere been attempted. Although the line of treatment here followed differs in some respects from that which he has adopted, I wish to record with gratitude my obligation to his interpretation, which has been of more service than anything else that I have seen in opening up the way to a fuller understanding of the allegory. End footnote. The Cry of the Indian Maiden. The cry of the Indian maiden, with which the story resumes its way, represents the cry that is always going up from humanity in all quarters of the world for sympathy and help. To Endymion this was a new and unexpected appeal, and yet it is one to which his heart instinctively responded. So, Keats would tell us, in the development of the soul of the poet, as he knew it, the ambition to excel in poetry first took possession of him, and it was only after he had been pursuing this aim for a considerable time that a new desire began to appeal to him, the desire of doing something to serve his fellow men. This was not a new conception for Keats. In Sleep and Poetry, which had appeared in a volume published in March 1817, he outlines the same order of development. "Oh, for 10 years that I may overwhelm myself in poesy, so may I do the deed that my own soul has to itself decreed." And after sketching symbolically the way in which he would spend this period of training, he goes on to say, "And can I ever bid these joys farewell? Yes, I must pass them for a nobler life, where I may find the agonies, the strife of human hearts." But a new element is introduced into the later treatment of the idea, that of the clash between the two ideals, and the doubt and perplexity of mind that is the consequence of this clash. The conflict of ideals. So keenly did Endymion realise the trouble of the Indian maid, and so fully did his heart respond to her appeal, that he felt perplexed and troubled beyond endurance. He loved his mysterious goddess no less than before. His intense delight in the beauty of the moon was as great as ever, and these two had already appeared to him to be in strange conflict. Book 3, lines 175 to 187. For he had not recognised them as two phases of one devotion. And now, to add to his perplexity, he felt himself drawn by an irresistible attraction to the Indian maiden, to whose tale of sorrow he had listened. "I have a triple soul," he cried, torn by this painful conflict of feeling. Such, Keats would have us understand, is the trouble and perplexity in the mind of the poet when he looks upon beauty of form and intensity of feeling in poetry as separate and conflicting ideals, more especially when their rivalry is complicated by a larger desire to do some service of real value to mankind. To Endymion it seems at the moment that he cannot but yield to the cry for sympathy and help, sacrificing all his former hopes and ideals, though such a sacrifice must bring death as a consequence. "Thou art my executioner, and I feel Loving and hatred, misery and weal, will in a few short hours be nothing to me, and all my story that much passion slew me." Line 111. The Song of Sorrow. But the maiden does not see that Endymion's love for her need bring any such dire consequences in its train. Leaving this doubt unsolved, Endymion asks her about her former life, and in response she sings a song, one of the most beautiful things in the whole poem, telling of the mystery and the inevitability of sorrow in human life. She goes on to speak of her unsatisfied longing for sympathy. In the whole world wide there was no one to ask me why I wept. Line 183. And then, telling the story that is always being repeated in the history of the race, she relates how she tried to find satisfaction in the pursuit of pleasure. And as I sat, over the light blue hills there came a noise of revellers. The rills into the wide stream came of purple hue. 'Twas Bacchus and his crew. Line 193. They called her to join them. Come hither, lady fair, and joined be to our wild minstrelsy. Line 226. She followed their invitation, and through every clime watched humanity yielding to the call of pleasure, but it was of no avail. Into these regions came I, following him, sick-hearted, weary. So I took a whim to stray away into these forests drear alone, without a peer, and I have told thee all thou mayest hear. Line 268. And she takes up again the song with which she began. Come then, sorrow, sweetest sorrow, like an own babe I nurse thee on my breast. I thought to leave thee and deceive thee, but now of all the world I love thee best. Line 279. An unfortunate passage with a true meaning. It seems strange that after such a surpassingly beautiful rendering of one aspect of his theme, Keats should have allowed himself to lapse immediately into a strain of weak and maudlin sentiment that, for the moment, excuses the worst severity of his critics, but so it is. The lines in which Endymion declares his devotion to the maiden fall as far below the normal level of the poem as did the former passage in which he expressed his passion for the unknown goddess. We feel inclined to adopt the lines that follow and to apply them to this part of the poem, to cry a triple woe that such words went echoing dismally through the wide forest, a most fearful tone. Line 321. But it is not difficult to recognise the intention that underlies the passage, and this is no less true and cogent than the expression of it is false and deplorable. Keats is trying to show with what irresistible force the passion for humanity may lay hold of a man when his ears and heart are open to its sorrows, and how he is impelled to put aside all other claims in order to devote himself wholly to this one service. A no less passionate devotion had filled the soul of Endymion when his mysterious goddess had last visited him. Book 3, lines 739 to 761, and, though we may well wish that both passages had been written in a manner more worthy of the genius that sustained Keats through so much of his work, we cannot but recognise that the parallelism in itself adds a true significance to the poem. The Cry of Woe. While Endymion was pouring out his protestations of love, a voice was heard crying, "Woe, woe, woe to that Endymion!" One can find little or no help in this place towards the explanation of this incident, but if we compare it with the later passage, lines 632 and following, where Endymion again declares his readiness to sacrifice everything in order to devote himself exclusively to the new-found love, we may gain some light on its meaning. In each case he is checked, in this instance by the cry of woe, in the later one by the refusal of the maiden. "I may not be thy love," line 752. The intention in each case probably is to suggest that if the poet in his passion for humanity abandons his poetic ideals, he is committing a grave error which cannot result in good. The Steeds. At this point in the story, Mercury appears and touches the earth with his wand. From it there spring two winged steeds. They evidently have a meaning similar to that of the chariot in Sleep and Poetry. They represent the power of the imagination. It may be noted that just as the chariot in the earlier poem appears immediately after the recognition by the poet of the necessity of entering into the agonies, the strife of human hearts, so in this case It is when he is distracted by the conflict of his feelings and is shuddering at the cry of woe that the intervention of Mercury takes place. Trusting himself to this new power, Endymion and his companion are carried aloft, far above the level of the earth. Endymion's readiness to follow divine leading. It is worth while turning back for a moment to note how this readiness of Endymion to commit himself to the guidance of what he felt to be a higher power offering to lead him is repeatedly illustrated in the course of the poem. It is suggested in each of the three original appearances, in the quickness with which he saw that some divine power was manifesting itself in the magic bed of flowers (Book I, line 559), in his readiness to follow the cloudy Cupid flying above the well (Book I, line 891), and again in his listening attitude before the voice called to him from the cave, and the eagerness with which he hurried in when he heard it (Book I, line 960). But it is shown more clearly as the story proceeds. When the golden butterfly came out of the flower he followed it with enthusiasm till it vanished (Book II, line 66). And then, when further direction was given to him, he did not "contend one moment in reflection" (Book II, line 215), but fled into the fearful deep. There, where the path that he was following ended, abrupt in middle air (Book II, line 653), he threw himself without one impious word (Book II, line 659) upon the eagle that crossed towards him, trusting himself unhesitatingly to this divine messenger, and caring not how perilous the adventure might seem. It was a similar instinct that led him to respond to the appeal of Glaucus for help (Book III, lines 282 and 712), and to listen to the cry of the Indian maid, and, as we shall see, the consummation is reached when Endymion explicitly declares himself ready to submit entirely to the will of heaven (Book IV, line 974). Inspiration and the poet. In all these instances Keats is showing us, by his usual method of concrete images, what he regards as the real meaning of poetic inspiration. There is the impulse or suggestion that appears to come from some source outside of the poet himself, but if any result is to follow, there must also be, on the part of the poet, a quickness to perceive and a readiness to respond to the promptings that come to him. It is, of course, a truth of wider application than that which is given to it here. But this is the aspect of it that belongs to the theme of the poem, and the repeated reference to the idea suggests how much value Keats placed upon it. It was a similar idea that he had pictured in Sleep and Poetry, when he represented the charioteer, the poet, as coming down in his car, the imagination, and while there pass before him shapes of delight and mystery and fear, he leans forward, most awfully intent, and seems to listen and writes with hurrying glow. It is a poet acting as the channel through which the divine can speak to humanity. In a letter written to Haydn, soon after he had begun to work at this poem, Keats gives expression to a similar feeling. "Thank God, I do begin arduously where I leave off, notwithstanding occasional depressions, and I hope for the support of a high power while I climb this little eminence (Endymion), and especially in my years of more momentous labour. I remember your saying that you had notions of a good genius presiding over you. I have of late had the same thought, for things which I do at random are afterwards confirmed by my judgment in a dozen features of propriety. Is it too daring to fancy Shakespeare this presider?" The incidents of the flight as a personal reminiscence. The incidents that follow upon the appearance of Mercury and the mounting of Endymion and his companion on the jet black steeds, though they may be considered conflicting and pointless so far as the mere story is concerned, are full of significance as a revelation of the working of the poet's mind. They include the flagging of the steeds at the approach of sleep, the dream of Endymion and his waking consciousness of the presence of his divine love, his perplexity as he turns now to her, now to the maiden beside him, and feels drawn alike to both, yet convinced that he is not unfaithful to either. Then comes the effort that Endymion makes to rouse the steeds again, the rising of the moon, the vanishing of the Indian maid, and the entry of Endymion into the cave of quietude. In attempting to trace the significance of these incidents we may, for the sake of clearness, think of them, in the first place, as representing a personal experience of the poet on some single occasion. Starting then a little further back than the series of events outlined above, we may picture him as sitting one evening and allowing his thoughts to centre round the agonies, the strife of human hearts, until he is led to wonder whether, after all, it were not better to try to do something to alleviate this suffering rather than to struggle on in the apparently hopeless effort to win fame as a poet. But before long his thoughts are touched as by an inspiration from heaven. He always saw ideas embodied, as Mr. Bradley justly remarks. His imagination is roused, and still keeping in mind the thought that had been with him before, he is carried aloft with a rush, and sees it all in a different light, under new aspects. Tired with the imaginative strain, he feels sleep coming upon him, and though he still tries to see more clearly what he is striving after, he does not succeed, and falling into unconsciousness, he begins to dream. His dream follows the line, not of his meditations of the moment, but of the ideas that have for a long time dominated his outlook upon life. He fancies that he has achieved his ideals as a poet, and that he has been found worthy to join the company of those whom he has reverenced as gods. He can take part in their life, and can a little use their instruments. Footnote. There is a poem entitled A Draught of Sunshine, edited Selincourt, page 353, which Keats sent to Reynolds in a letter of 31st of January 1818, the same letter in which he wrote out one of his most beautiful sonnets, When I have fears that I may cease to be. Endymion was at this time passing through the press and was receiving some final touches. It is probable that these lines refer to this part of the story, and thus have more point and value than has yet been allowed to them. End footnote. It is but a dream, and yet, when he wakes, it seems at first as if it were true, and he feels that this power is really his. He is indeed a poet. What has become of his desire to serve mankind? Must this be abandoned? In perplexity he turns from one ideal to the other, feeling that he is bound to follow each of them, yet not knowing how they can be reconciled. He calls to mind the flight of imagination which, before he fell asleep, had so magically uplifted these aspirations for service, and tries to renew this aspect of his thoughts. But a gleam of the old poetic desires that had so long haunted him comes into his mind. His passion to do something for humanity falls away, and, exhausted by the conflict of emotion through which he has passed, he sinks into a dreamless sleep. It is not, of course, intended to suggest that the experiences here outlined were necessarily confined to a single occasion. It may well have been that the desire to give some practical kind of help towards relief of human suffering developed gradually in the mind of Keats, that there was more than one occasion on which the poetical impulse that was never far beneath the surface of his consciousness, acting on this desire, lifted it up into the region of creative imagination, and that periods of exhaustion and moods of apathy intervened. The significance of the story is not bound up with any particular time scheme, but whether it pictures for us the experience of a single occasion or one that was spread over some longer period of time, it represents a phase in the process of Keats' poetic development, and one that he regards as of more than personal significance. The Wedding Guests. While Endymion lay unconscious in the cave of quietude, there passed by a skyey mask, a pinioned multitude. Line 558. They sang a song in celebration of the coming marriage feast of Diana. We are probably intended to understand by this the attitude, not so much of the general public, as that section of it which has a genuine interest in poetry, and which recognises the early dawn of a new era, such as the new romantic movement in poetry. Among such as these there may be confidence and rejoicing at a time when the poet himself, who has given cause for such feelings, is still far from regarding his hopes as satisfied or his aims as accomplished. He may indeed be very little conscious of the interest and pleasure that others are taking in his work. Endymion returns to earth. Soon after this Endymion's steed descended. He found himself once more on the solid earth, and close at hand was the Indian maid. The dreams that he had cherished, the ideals after which he had striven, now appeared to him unreal, or at least hopeless of attainment, and he declared that he would put them aside and devote himself wholeheartedly to the service of his new-found love. But, to his unutterable dismay, she told him that this could not be. No such end to his perplexity and trouble was possible. He knew not how to answer her, and while he sat in a stupor of grief and despair, Peona came to greet them. The Poet and Practical Life. There is little difficulty in the interpretation of this part of the story, if we follow the track that has led us thus far. After a prolonged and lofty flight of the imagination, a reaction is bound to follow. The poet must inevitably come down to earth again, and once more find himself in contact with the troubles and pains of human life. And if these have before aroused his solicitude and sympathy, in the mood of such a reaction their appeal will be stronger than ever. Poetry, especially on the side of beauty of form and expression, may seem for the time an unpractical pursuit, especially if, after trying for long months and years to attain to lofty ideals, the poet is conscious that he has always fallen short of them. I have clung to nothing, loved nothing, nothing seen or felt but a great dream. Line 636. So he turns with a sigh of relief to a more direct and more practical way of helping mankind. The desires and ambitions that he has so long cherished appear now to be hopelessly unattainable, and he resolves that he will no longer be guilty of the folly of pursuing them. Against his proper glory has my own soul conspired. So my story will I to children utter, and repent. There never lived a mortal man who bent his appetite beyond his natural sphere, but starved and died. My sweetest Indian, here, here will I kneel, for thou redeemed hast my life from too thin breathing, gone and past are cloudy phantasms. Caverns lone, farewell, and air of visions, and the monstrous swell of visionary seas. No, never more shall airy voices cheat me to the shore of tangled wonder, breathless and aghast. Adieu, my daintiest dream, although so vast my love is still for thee. The hour may come when we shall meet in pure Elysium. On earth I may not love thee. Line 643. Footnote. In a similar mood he wrote to Haydn, 11th of May 1817. There is no greater sin after the seven deadly than to flatter oneself into an idea of being a great poet. End footnote. But however welcome such a cutting of the Gordian knot may seem for the moment as a relief from the doubts and perplexities that he has been trying to face, no such resolve can be a permanent solution of his difficulties. The call of the divine ideal has been too clear, the response has been too spontaneous, the efforts to reach the ideal have been too intense, to be abandoned in this way, and humanity itself cannot accept of service rendered at such a cost. It would involve an unfaithfulness that could but lead to death, and the poet is, for a time, thrown back upon his perplexities and uncertainties. Returning to the scene of the earlier visions. There is some significance in the fact that, at this point of the story, Endymion is back again, though he is unconscious of it, in the very spot where he had first seen the vision that had called him out from the ordinary life of men. The long process of training through which Endymion had passed could not, of itself, make him a poet. Before that end could be attained, he must return to the source of inspiration that had given the original impulse to his new way of life. This is the essential element in the whole process, without which all the rest, useful and even necessary as it may be, must fail of its effect, for it is this inspiration that alone gives life and power to the words of the poet. Peona. The last occasion on which we heard of Peona was when she tried to soothe the spirit of Endymion, troubled by the early visions that he had seen, and to draw him back to his former natural and healthy manner of life. Line 991. During the period of his strange, fantastic wanderings, he has been far out of her ken, but now that he has returned once more to the scenes of his earlier youth, she comes to him with glad welcome, and rejoices in the hope of his resuming a more normal mode of life. There is nothing selfish in her attitude. She welcomes with open heart the beautiful stranger, but completely misinterprets the situation, and is reduced to bewildered amazement when Endymion puts all her hopeful suggestions on one side, declaring that he will live a hermit life, and that Peona herself shall be his only visitant. The perplexity of rival claims. The strange impasse to which the adventures of Endymion have led appears to represent, in a large measure, the personal experience of Keats, though the general situation has a wider meaning. There seems to have been a time when he was greatly perplexed and harassed in his outlook upon life. On the one hand, the desire of making his name live in the ranks of the poets was very strong within him. On the other, he was oppressed by the pains and sorrows of his fellow men, and longed to devote himself to their service. In the days when he was working as a medical student, poetry was, to his mind, the zenith of all his aspirations, the only thing worthy the attention of superior minds. Such is the record of one of his fellow students, already quoted. But a little later we find him writing, "I find there is no worthy pursuit but the idea of doing some good to the world." Footnote: To John Taylor, 24th of April 1818. This letter reads as if he had recently cleared up the difficulty referred to above. End footnote. And it would appear that, for a time, he could see no way of reconciling the two ideals. He was drawn most powerfully towards each of them, so much so that he could not, without pain, think of forsaking either. Yet for the time it seemed that he could not follow them both. He must choose between them. Still less was it possible to return to the ordinary life of men from which he had felt himself to be separated ever since he had seen the vision of poetic beauty. And so a feeling of depression settled down upon him. His ideals were unattainable. A return to his former life was impossible. There seemed to be no way out of the tangle of contradiction. He was inclined to seek for peace in solitude, and to abandon both ideals as being beyond his reach. Yet he could find no satisfaction in such a decision. To cut himself off from the aims and aspirations that had lifted him above the ordinary ways of men would not give rest to his soul. Thus far it may be that we have been shown how the struggle and perplexity worked in the mind of Keats. The denouement is finally conceived, and pictures for us a truth of universal significance. Endymion, feeling the impossibility of cutting himself off thus from all that he had longed for, begged Peona to bring the Indian maid that evening to meet him once more. They were to come to the groves behind the temple of Diana. So strongly did he feel the futility of all his hopes and efforts that at one moment he was ready to welcome death, though at another it seemed a cruel end to what he knew had been at least a sincere striving towards the light. The resolving of the perplexity. In this mood he approached the temple and met Peona and the Indian maid. When Peona asked him what was to happen next, his answer showed that he had reached some solution of his doubts and perplexities, the solution, that is, of willingness to submit entirely to the guidance of a higher power. "Sister, I would have command, if it were heaven's will, on our sad fate." line 975. And then the final revelation is granted to him, and he learns, to his amazement and joy, that the goddess, whom he has so long pursued, but has never fully known, and the Indian maiden, who has called out his passionate devotion, are not rivals for his love, but are different aspects of the same being, whom he now knows in truth, and to whom he will henceforth be joined in deathless delight. So it is, Keats would tell us, when the poet comes to realise that his longing aspirations after beauty and perfection in his poetry, and his passionate desire to serve his fellow creatures, are not conflicting ideals, but are one and the same, that for him to use faithfully and earnestly his poetic gift is to render the highest service to mankind. Then he has become a true poet. Peona's share. It is a pleasant little touch that Peona is not shut out from a share in this joyful climax, though she fails to comprehend its meaning. The poet's ways are in a large measure ways where others cannot follow him, yet he does not lose touch with their life; and the men and women, not a small company, to whom poetry is little better than sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal, and who find it incomprehensible that a lifetime should be devoted to it, may yet have some share in the beauty and joy that it brings into human life. The introduction to the fourth book. The introduction to this book dwells on the way in which English poetry, refusing to be merely imitative of even the best of what other lands could offer, waited until the time had come to develop its own genius, and Keats feels that the new movement in poetry, with the celebration of which this poem is largely concerned, represents the full fruition of the hopes that had so long been waiting for fulfilment. The note thus sounded is in harmony with the triumphant close to which the story finally attains. End of section. Section 5 of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The story of Glaucus in Keats' Endymion. The story of Glaucus, as it is told by Keats in the third book of Endymion, is based upon some passages in the 13th and 14th books of Ovid's Metamorphoses. There is still some difference of opinion as to the meaning that Keats intended to convey by this part of his poem, and an examination of the way in which he has handled his materials and the changes that he has introduced into the story may throw light on the question at issue. The story, as given by Ovid, runs as follows. Glaucus was a fisherman, taking great delight in the sea and spending his life on or near it. One day, having come to a meadow which had never before been visited by man or beast, he spread out on the bank the fishes that he had caught. To his surprise he saw them, after nibbling at the grass on which they lay, move over the land and slip down again into the sea. He wondered what cause could have worked such a marvel, and himself plucked and tasted some of the grass. At once his nature was changed. He plunged into the sea and was fit to be received into the sacred fellowship of the sea gods. Then he met Silla and loved her, but she fled from him, and not being able to induce her to listen to him, he appealed to Circe for help. But Circe replied, according to the version of George Sandys of which Keats made use, "The willing with more ease pursue, who wish the same, whom equal flames subdue. For thou, O well, deserv'st to be pursued. Give hope and credit me, thou shalt be wooed. Rest therefore of thy beauty confident. Lo, I, a goddess, radiant soul's descent, in herbs so potent, and no less in charms, proffer myself and pleasures to thy arms. Scorn her that scorns thee, her that seeks pursue, and in one deed revenge thyself of two." Glaucus, however, rejected her advances. "First shady groves shall on the billows grow, and seaweeds to the mountain tops remove, ere I and Scylla living change my love." Circe was angered, but not being able, nor indeed willing, to harm Glaucus, who was now, like herself, divine, she bent her wrath upon Silla. She poisoned a pool where Silla was wont to bathe. Now Silla came, and wading to the waist, beheld her hips with barking dogs embraced, starts back, at first not thinking that they were part of herself, but rates them, and doth fear their threatening jaws, but those from whom she flies she with her hails. Glaucus wept at the change, and refused to have anything to do with Circe. Silla, in hatred of Circe, destroyed the companions of Ulysses, and was only prevented from sinking the Trojan ships by being further transformed into a rock, the stony prodigy yet eminent from which the seamen fly. When we turn to Endymion to see in what fashion Keats has handled this curious legend, the first point that attracts our notice is that he has made no use of the quaint and picturesque account of the way in which Glaucus came to win the freedom of the sea. The fishes that used the magic properties of the grass to get back into the sea, and thus showed Glaucus how he could enter the new life for which he longed, play no part in the story as it is told in the pages of Endymion. In this poem Glaucus, impelled by his desire for the sea, simply plunged for life or death, and found, to his astonishment, that he could live in the denser element. It appears at first sight rather surprising that such a promising bit of material should have been cast aside. But if Keats had some meaning to express with which the incident could not be related, one can see why it had to be rejected, even though the story was thereby rendered more tame and flat. It would carry us beyond the limits available to attempt to discuss every detail of the narrative, but we may select 4 leading points where Keats has introduced original elements into it, and examine these with a view to seeing what light they may throw on the purpose underlying this part of the poem. 1. In the story of Glaucus himself there is at the outset a strong resemblance to that of Endymion. Each lives a life in close contact with nature. Each delights in solitude, while showing a kindly disposition towards those around him who cannot share his aspirations or even understand them. Each again feels a restless longing for a life different from that which he has been living, and in each there springs up an intense desire for union with a being, or the attainment of an ideal, only to be achieved after a long period of probation. The later story is not, however, a mere repetition of the earlier. Endymion was a prince and a wanderer of the forest and mountain, while Glaucus was a fisherman, and his delight was all in the sea. And they soon diverge from one another, for while Endymion, though sometimes despondent, remains faithful throughout to the ideal that he is striving to reach, Glaucus yields to the baleful charms of Circe, and, forgetting Silla, gives himself up to the pleasures with which his new mistress surrounds him. So Keats tells the story, but it was not thus that he found it in Ovid, for Ovid says that Glaucus firmly and decisively rejected the advances of Circe. Footnote: Talia temptanti prius inquit in aequore frondes, Glaucus, et un summis nascentur montibus algae, sospite quam Silla nostri mutentur amores. Metamorphoses, Book 14, line 37. End footnote. Here, then, if Keats is not inventing at random, we may look for a clue to the meaning of the story. It is generally accepted that the story of Endymion, as told by Keats, was intended to represent the growth of the poetic passion in the mind of the poet, and if this be so, we can hardly fail to recognise a significance in the close similarity which the earlier part of the story of Glaucus bears to that of Endymion. In each we have the same unsatisfied longings, the same reaching after an apparently unattainable ideal, and if the aspirations of Endymion stand for the rise of the poetic impulse in an individual or in a community, it seems difficult to refuse a similar significance to those of Glaucus. and the divergence of their stories suggests that while the later poetic movement, represented by Endymion, remained faithful to the ideal that inspired it, the earlier, for which Glaucus stands, had been seduced from the loftiness of purpose that had at first inspired it, and had followed lower and less worthy aims. Had English poetry ever passed through an experience of this kind? It is beyond question that Keats believed that it had, and the picture that he draws, with no authority from Ovid, of Glaucus, forgetting the beautiful maiden who eluded his pursuit, and yielding to the lower fascinations of the evil-minded enchantress, is quite an effective presentation of his view of what had happened to English poetry in the days of the pseudo-classical school. He felt that it had then forsaken the ideal after which it had been striving, and had allowed itself to fall under the allurements of a false enticement. And the punishment that Circe inflicted upon Glaucus when he discovered her exercising her baleful charms upon other victims, a punishment invented by Keats in wilful disregard of the statement of Ovid that Circe could do no such thing. Footnote: Indignata dea est, et ledere quatenus ipsum non poterat, nec velit amans. Metamorphoses, Book 14, line 40. End footnote. Was the punishment that fell upon English poetry as the direct result of yielding to these enticements. It lost all poetic force and fell into decrepitude. They went about holding a poor decrepit standard out, as Keats himself has put it in another place. Whether we accept or differ from this view of Pope and his school is of no moment. The point is that this revision of the story of Glaucus forms a very effective pictorial representation of the view that was held and proclaimed by Keats and others who were associated with him in the new poetical movement. 2. The changes that Keats has made in the story, as it concerns Silla, are in harmony with this interpretation. In the Metamorphoses, the vengeance of Circe falls mainly upon her, and she is changed into a hideous shape surrounded by ravening dogs. Nor is she ever restored to her former beauty, but in Endymion no such disfigurement is allowed to overtake her. Circe merely puts her into a death-like trance, in which her beauty is not marred and from which she is eventually restored to life. And we can understand this change if we recognise that Silla, like Diana, stands for a poetical ideal, beautiful and attractive in itself, but ceasing, as Keats felt, to exercise any living power over men during the time of which we have spoken. The story, as told by Ovid, is picturesque and striking, but it would not carry the meaning that was required. Keats could not speak of the ideal as changed into something ugly and monstrous. It had become powerless for a time, but one day it would live again, and draw men after it as before. And so the story of Silla is modified to suit the meaning that was to be conveyed. 3. In describing the part that Circe plays in the story, Keats has used the narrative of the Metamorphoses as a starting point, and has also drawn upon his reminiscences of the account of her given in the 10th book of the Odyssey. But here again the line that he takes soon begins to diverge from that of his predecessors. In his version of the story, Glaucus waked one morning and found that Circe was not with him. He searched through the forest, and at length came upon her seated upon an uptorn forest root, and surrounded by the creatures over whom she was tyrannizing. She fed them with grapes from a basket, and then, having sprinkled a branch of mistletoe with some sooty oil, she whisked it in their eyes. They shrieked and groaned with pain, their bodies began to swell, and then, carried through the air as if by a whirlwind, they vanished. Footnote: Endymion, Book 3, lines 476 to 530. End footnote. It is a most fantastic story, and it seems unlikely that Keats would, in wanton idleness of fancy, have turned it into such a grotesque form. It is more reasonable to suppose that he had some purpose in view. Circe obviously stands for an influence of a very sinister kind, and, if the line of interpretation already suggested is the true one, it follows that he must represent, in some way, the activities of the pseudo-classical school, and a detailed examination of the passage will show that it bears distinct marks of having been developed, with very little help from Ovid or Homer, so as to present a portrait, or a caricature, not so much of the classical school in general as of its chief representative, Alexander Pope, in particular. We have the central and commanding position that Pope occupied among the swarm of petty scribblers and satirists of his day, and all around her shapes, wizard and brute, laughing and wailing, grovelling, serpentining, showing tooth, tusk, and venom bag, and sting. Oh, such deformities! Endymion, Book 3, line 500. His overbearing attitude towards these minor poets. Fierce, wan, and tyrannising was the lady's look, line 506. The contemptuous way in which he flung his poems to the admirers and flatterers by whom he was surrounded, and the eagerness with which they received them. Oft times upon the sudden she laughed out, and from a basket emptied to the rout clusters of grapes, the which they ravened quick and roared for more. Line 509. Then follows a lively sketch of the way in which Pope turned upon these versifiers and spattered them with the acid of his satire. Avenging, slow, anon she took a branch of mistletoe, and emptied on't a black dull gurgling phial, groaned one and all, as if some piercing trial was sharpening for their pitiable bones. She lifted up the charm, appealing groans from their poor breasts went suing to her ear in vain. Remorseless as an infant's bier, she whisked against their eyes the sooty oil, whereat was heard a noise of painful toil, increasing gradual to a tempest rage, shrieks, yells, and groans of torture pilgrimage. The details have been selected so as to correspond with remarkable exactness to the facts. The first two words, avenging, slow, one of which at least is not particularly appropriate for Circe, for she had nothing to avenge, her anger had not yet been roused against Glaucus, can be used with the exactness of the Dunciad, which has been described as a plan of vengeance long meditated, carefully matured, and skilfully executed by the poet. The character of the contents, the anger and consternation that followed its appearance, the attitude of the author, are all depicted with an incisive humour which is the sign of Keats' growing mastery over his work. The close adherence to the facts of the case is further marked by the division of the torment into two stages, of which the first is more of the nature of a threat, while the second is an open attack. This is exactly what had happened, for in March 1727 to 1728 there had appeared a volume of miscellanies by Swift and Pope, in which was included a treatise in prose on bathos, or the art of sinking in poetry. In this Pope satirises various classes of writers of his time, but the attack is not often personal, and individual writers are indicated only by initials which Pope declared to have chosen at random. It caused no small outcry. Groaned one and all as if some piercing trial was sharpening for their pitiable bones. And this proved to be the case, for a few months later the Dunciad was published, and in this the numerous writers who fell under the poet's lash found themselves attacked by name, and the satire was more personal and more biting. The lines in which the outcome of the whole affair is described form a startling climax. Then a sight, more wildering than all that horse affright, for the whole herd, as by a whirlwind writhen, went through the dismal air like one huge python antagonizing Boreas, and so vanished. Yet there was not a breath of wind. She banished these phantoms with a nod. As an incident in the story, it is grotesque in the extreme. As an account of Circe's magic, it is quite unauthorized by any of the classical sources upon which Keats was supposed to be drawing, but as a description of the effect of the Dunciad upon the minor poets of Pope's time, it is the simple truth. They have all vanished from the realms of literature, and today only those who have made a special study of the period could tell even their names. If further evidence is needed to show that Circe is intended to represent Pope in this passage, it will be found in the pages of the Bathos, to which reference has already been made. From that work it may be seen that the identification did not originate with Keats, but with no less an authority than Pope himself. In the 6th chapter he says: I shall range these confined and less copious geniuses under proper classes, and, the better to give their pictures to the reader, under the names of animals of some sort or other. 1. The flying fishes. These are writers who now and then rise upon their fins and fly out of the profound, but their wings are soon dry, and they drop down to the bottom. G.S. A.H. C.G. meaning George Stepney, Aaron Hill, and Charles Gilden. 2. The swallows are authors that are eternally skimming and fluttering up and down, but all their agility is employed to catch flies. L.T. W.P. Lord H. Lewis Theobald, William Pulteney, Lord Hervey. And in the following paragraphs he represents other writers as ostriches, parrots, they that repeat another's words in such a hoarse odd voice as makes them seem their own, didappers, porpoises, frogs, eels, and tortoises. And having thus transformed his victims after the manner of Circe, he proceeds in the following chapter with cynical impertinence to say of his former friend Broom: the author's pencil, like the wand of Circe, turns all into monsters at a stroke. Warton, in his edition of Pope, published about 20 years before Endymion was written, says of chapter 6: this was the chapter that gave so much offence, and excited such loud clamours against our author by his introduction of these initial letters, which he in vain asserted were placed at random and meant no particular writers, which was not believed. It seems sufficiently evident that we have here the origin of the Circe episode in Endymion. 4. In a culmination of the story we find Keats departing altogether from the authority to which he has hitherto paid some degree of attention, and striking out a line of his own. In the Metamorphoses, Silla is changed into a rock, and becomes a menace to those who sail between Sicily and Italy, but in Endymion she is restored to active life and to her former beauty, and her union with Glaucus is crowned with the blessing of Neptune. It is a startling change, and no less so is the account of the means by which the restoration was brought about. It appears to be a pure invention on the part of Keats, and is either a wanton piece of triviality without sense or meaning, as we are sometimes invited to believe, or it is a pictorial representation of one of the great events in the history of English literature. If the interpretation that has been outlined above represents at all accurately what Keats meant by the story of Glaucus, as he had found it in Ovid and modified it to suit his own purpose, it is evident that he would, at this point, be faced by the necessity of devising some method of representing the sequel. He had shown us how English poetry, falling under the baleful influence of the classical school, had become ineffective and impotent, but he could not leave it there. He was conscious that a new life had been breathed into poetry since the time of Pope, and was even then pulsing through its veins. And so he invents the account of the way in which Glaucus was restored to youth and vigour. The passage is too long to quote. Endymion, Book 3, lines 645 and following. But the essence of it is that Glaucus, sitting one day on a rock, saw a gallant vessel approaching. As she came nearer, a tempest arose. She was wrecked, and the feebleness which the curse of Circe had brought upon him prevented Glaucus from saving any of those who cried for help. As he was lamenting his inability to rescue them, there emerged from the waters at his feet an old man's hand, grasping a scroll and a wand. He laid hold of these, and even caught the old man's finger, but it slipped through his enfeebled grasp, and the last survivor of the wreck perished. The scroll, however, was saved. Glaucus read it with rapt attention, and found in it a promise of redemption. When Endymion came to him, the magic power of the scroll was made evident. Torn into pieces and scattered by the hand of Endymion in the face of Glaucus, it restored him to youthful vigour, while Silla and all those whose bodies had been tended by Glaucus during the time of his decrepitude were brought back to life by the same means. The story is fantastic enough, but when the details are examined it will be found that they show, in picturesque form, how the revival of poetry was brought about in the latter part of the 18th century. It has long been recognised that in Percy's relics of ancient English poetry we have the most complete embodiment of the forces that were at work to produce this result. Wordsworth bears emphatic testimony to this effect. For our own country, he says, its poetry has been absolutely redeemed by it. Footnote. Essay supplementary to the preface to the 1815 edition of Wordsworth's poems. There appears to be something more than an accidental connection between this essay and the part of Endymion under consideration. In an earlier passage Wordsworth speaks of the arts by which Pope contrived to procure to himself a more general and a higher reputation than perhaps any English poet ever attained during his lifetime. He refers to the undue exertion of these arts, and speaks of Pope as having bewitched the nation by his melody. We learn from Keats' letters that he was staying at Oxford with his friend Bailey at the time when he was writing the story of Glaucus, and that they had been reading Wordsworth together. Letter to Reynolds, 21st of September 1817. End footnote. And later criticism has confirmed this point of view. Sir Richard Garnett, for example, says that it made an era not only in English but in European literature, affording the date from which, upon the whole, the commencement of the Romantic School may most fitly be reckoned. And Keats sketches in the story of it with vivid strokes. The vessel that comes from the horizon's brink stands for the ballad literature that had come down from the earlier centuries and in which men were beginning to take a new interest. The wrecking of the ship and the gulfing of all on board represent the disappearance of the great mass of the ballads and the complete oblivion that has overtaken their authors. The crew had gone by one and one to pale oblivion. Much more might have been rescued from the remains of this part of our literature, Keats tells us, but for the paralysing influence of the pseudo-classical school. Oh, they had all been saved, but crazed eld annulled my vigorous cravings, and thus quelled and curbed, think on't, O Latmian, did I sit writhing with pity and a cursing fit against that hell-born Circe. Endymion, Book 3, line 661. But a scroll was saved from the wreck, and here, with a broadly realistic touch, is represented the famous manuscript out of which the relics grew. Just as Percy was barely in time to save it from destruction, so the scroll was with difficulty, and only at the last moment, rescued from the waves, and as the unknown transcriber of the manuscript sank into oblivion, though his work was preserved, so the hand that held out the scroll to Glaucus slipped through his grasp, and the unknown benefactor sank out of sight. As a story of a wreck, there is little point or meaning about it, but it gains in both if it is intended to represent the central incident in the revival of poetry. The scroll saved by Glaucus contained the promise of deliverance from his miserable state, but attached to the promise were two conditions. Endymion, Book 3, lines 696 and following. The first of these is stated simply and directly. He must study nature with sincere and earnest purpose to understand her meaning. The second is given in a more symbolical manner. All lovers, tempest-tossed, and in the savage overwhelming lost, he shall deposit side by side, until time's creeping shall the dreary space fulfil. by which is meant that the reverent regard paid to the older poets during the age of Pope was one of the conditions that helped to make the later revival possible. Pope himself had a great reverence for Spenser, but it would be difficult to trace any effective influence that Spenser exerted upon him. So we are told that these bodies lay to all appearance dead, deposited side by side, on the shelves of those who could draw no living inspiration from them. But their beauty remained unspoiled. Endymion found their patient lips all ruddy, for here death no blossom nips. Line 739. It was from these two sources that the new romantic movement drew much of its inspiration, a sympathetic study of nature and a reverent regard for the great poets of earlier times. Neither the relics, however, nor the fulfilment of these conditions could, of themselves, effect the deliverance of poetry. They could do no more than quell one half of the witch. Line 644. A living force was needed, and so it was not until Endymion, representing the spirit of the new poetry, came upon the scene that any change could be brought about. He it was who, scattering in the face of Glaucus some pieces of the scroll, restored him to youthful vigour, and then, showering these powerful fragments on Silla and on the files of seemingly dead bodies, brought them back to life. Thus was accomplished the revival of poetry, which meant so much to those who shared in it that they wandered to and fro, distracted with the richest overflow of joy that ever poured from heaven. Lines 804 and following. When this interpretation of Keats' rendering of the story of Glaucus was first put forward, with less evidence in support of it than has now been adduced, some critics accepted it, but others, whose opinion one cannot but respect, pronounced a verdict of not proven. This fresh presentation of the argument may perhaps justify a reconsideration of the verdict, but in any case it is worthwhile to consider very briefly the alternatives that are open if this interpretation be not accepted. It is clear that Keats either meant what has here been suggested, or he had some other meaning in mind, or he meant nothing in particular, and was merely allowing his imagination to wander at random. No other meaning, however, appears to have been proposed for this part of the story, so that this alternative does not call for discussion. The view that is taken, so far as one can gather, by those who have hitherto felt unable to accept the present interpretation, is that Keats had no definite meaning in mind in writing this story, which amounts to saying that Keats, in the middle of what he was trying to make a great poem, allowed himself to wander from the point, and to indulge for pages at a time in writing irrelevant nonsense that had no bearing upon anything in particular. Now, there is an inherent improbability about this position, greater than appears to be realised by those who have assumed it. That the poem as a whole has a meaning and a purpose is common ground. Sir Sidney Colvin, who cannot be claimed as a supporter of the interpretation here put forward, states it thus: "The tale of the loves of the Greek shepherd prince and the moon goddess turns under his hand into a parable of the adventures of the poetic soul striving after full communion with the spirit of essential beauty." Professor Oliver Elton puts it in a similar way. The pains and pleasures that come to the poetic soul in its search for ideal beauty are figured under Endymion's adventures, and the moon herself is the image of such beauty. But if a real significance underlies the figure of Endymion and the story of his adventures, it is surely unlikely that the figure of Glaucus and the story of his adventures, which fill nearly the whole of the third book of the poem, have no significance, but are mere meaningless fancies, especially in view of the fact that Endymion himself is closely linked up with them. Moreover, the subject with which Keats was dealing was the one on which, of all possible subjects, he was least likely to write irrelevant nonsense. Poetry was to his mind, says one of his fellow students in the medical school, the zenith of all his aspirations, the only thing worthy the attention of superior minds. So he thought. all other pursuits were mean and tame. He had no idea of fame or greatness, but as it was connected with the pursuits of poetry, or the attainment of poetical excellence. The greatest men in the world were the poets, and to rank among them was the chief object of his ambition. And bearing this in mind, one is compelled to feel that the improbability of his representing in picturesque form his ideas about an important, though to him an objectionable, phase of English poetry, in the course of a poem which admittedly deals with some aspects of that subject, is less than the improbability of his scribbling grotesque and meaningless pictures across the pages of such a poem. Keats was a thinker as well as a singer, and to suppose that he would have allowed himself to fill up a poem of this kind with mere idle dreaming, having no point or sense, seems neither fair to the poet nor critically sound. It has been shown that the variations on the original story, which are due to the invention of Keats, fit with peculiar exactness into the interpretation that has been outlined above. This interpretation corresponds with the views which Keats is known to have held on the classical school of poetry, and the most natural inference would appear to be that this is the meaning which he intended to convey. That he has not succeeded in conveying it to the majority of those who have read the poem, probably not a very large number, must be admitted. He was, as we know from his letters, tired of the poem before he had done with it, and was, no doubt, disappointed, as the artist usually is, at the difference between his original conception and the form into which he had shaped it. The ridicule which was poured upon it by a few, and the indifference of the world at large, added to his own feeling about the poem, would leave him with little inclination to explain what he meant by it. And so, in those of his letters which have come down to us, though he must have written many others, there is little or nothing to help us in tracing out its intention. But the verdict of Keats' contemporaries has long been set aside. Together with many weaknesses and imperfections, it is now agreed that Endymion contains much that is beautiful and effective, and if we recognise in it a richer meaning and a more definite purpose than has hitherto been suspected, we lose nothing of our delight in its poetic beauty, but gain a sense of reality and significance that can only add to its value. Stellenbosch, South Africa, 23rd of February 1921. End of section. End of An Interpretation of Keats' Endymion by Henry Clement Notcutt. Read by Algie Pug.